Hare Om Namaha. In the second half of 1970, Prabhupada's still fledgling movement was afflicted by its second major crisis. Here's an excerpt from a letter about that to Hangsaduta, a leading secretary of ISKCON, dated September 2nd, 1970, quote, regarding the poisonous effect in our society, it is a fact, and I know wherefrom this poison tree has sprung up and how it affected practically the whole society in a very dangerous form. I have heard that Brahmananda is preaching about me that I am Krishna, that I am Super Soul, that I have withdrawn my mercy from the disciples, that I have left the society, and so on. You are also one of the members of the GBC, so you can think over very deeply how to save the situation. It is a fact, however, that the great sinister movement is within our society, unquote. Led by Brahmananda, the first temple president of ISKCON, this crisis was spread by him to his godbrother Gargamuni, Vishnu Jan then, and after that Subal. All four of these men were very influential in the ISKCON society. About a month later, here is an excerpt from a letter to one of these ringleaders. Quote, before preaching that your spiritual master is God, you never consulted me whether it was right. This means you were inspired by some external influence. Subal said that it was a mystic influence. That mystic influence was widely spread, which I clearly saw in Honolulu, Tokyo, or in other words, wherever Brahmananda went, unquote. Spending thousands of dollars, Prabhupada had made purchases of devotional paraphernalia from India in the early years of his movement. Many of these accounts payable were not being honored by the requisite shipping of the items purchased in advance. As such, Prabhupada sent one of his first disciples to India to collect that accounts payable. In the process, Brahmananda stopped off at Gaudiya Math centers. Prabhupada barely spoke to his disciples about Gaudiya Math, his godbrothers, and or his interactions with them. He was not their emissary. He could have easily incorporated his society in America as Gaudiya Math, even if his godbrothers had opposed it. Instead, in 1966, during the same period he was initiating his first batch of followers, he incorporated as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He received virtually no help from any of his godbrothers at any time, including when he asked by letter, by snail mail, to India for assistance in 1965 after having first arrived alone in New York City in September of that year. They were inimical to him. Via political intrigue, two prominent godbrothers had shut down an organization he had established in Jhansi in the 50s in India. None of his godbrothers approved his going to America to preach, although this duty had been assigned to him by his spiritual master, Siddhanta Saraswati. They believed that Prabhupada made a major offense against Siddhanta Saraswati by taking that title of Prabhupada, which his godbrothers believed was reserved for Siddhanta Saraswati only. Even though Prabhupada was a completely pure scholar in spiritual science, honored as such by the title of Bhaktivedanta, and was a Mahabhagavat, that was not really recognized by Gaudiya Math. Not in reality. As such, once they had the opportunity, they poisoned Brahmananda when he visited some of them. He brought that contamination back to ISKCON, and a crisis erupted. The movement could have cratered, but Prabhupada took effective action to prevent that. We continue to analyze another chapter of Henry Doktorski's most important work, entitled 11 Naked Emperors. Henceforward, we refer to it by its acronym ENE. We have now reached chapter 14, aptly entitled, quote-unquote, the Neo-Gaudiya Math. This is a term for that deviant entity which your host speaker introduced soon after it gained traction in ISKCON. It is a very difficult chapter to review for a number of reasons. On the whole, indeed in all cases, I have given every previous chapter of his work, Doktorski's work in this book, a deserved high grade. Sometimes an A+, sometimes an A, sometimes an A-, once in a while a B+. Lowest grade ever was a B. There have been flaws in most of those chapters, but I have elucidated them. Indeed, Doktorski has done yeoman's work in his research, in his investigations, providing so much information concerning the immediate aftermath of Prabhupada's movement, which otherwise would have merged into oblivion had he not found it out. Although I did not thus far grade every chapter, be assured, as I just mentioned, that none of them scored lower than a straight B. Such grades do not carry over to this chapter, however, as it is severely flawed in many ways, although it does have some redeeming features. First, concerning the redeeming features, he has revealed many historical specifics that were either entirely unknown or mostly so. They are now on and for the record, and as such, they will not merge into oblivion, at least not anytime soon. Secondly, he has quoted me profusely in this chapter. By my count, I am quoted 8 times, some of them very extensive quotes. These quotes of myself, your host speaker, work against the drift of the chapter, which certainly favors Neo-Mutt. There is no ahankar whatsoever in any of the commentary that I shot off to Doktorski concerning Neo-Mutt and its primary figurehead, the person it relied upon. The minority report has been presented by myself, and for all practical purposes, I was the chief devotee presenting it in an uncompromising way. Doktorski recognized this, so he featured my quotes. In the beginning of chapter 14, he presents, in a very specific and chronological manner, the origin of Neo-Gaudiya Math. In the beginning, Neo-Mutt was called the Mahamandala. Then it was called the Guardian of Devotion, acronym GOD. Quite the pretension. Now it is known as the World Vaishnava Association, WVA, which holds annual conclaves in Mayapur every year. Chapter 14 begins as follows, quote, as the oppressive zonal acharya regime alienated hundreds, if not thousands, of disciples of Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada in the early and mid-80s, some estranged disciples discovered an alternate Gaudiya Vaishnava society, which included a number of elder and apparently advanced devotees in the various branches of the Gaudiya Math, but especially Prabhupada's older godbrother, Bhakti Rakshaka Sridhar Maharaja, unquote. A salient point is made here. So-called ISKCON in general, under the management of the governing body commission, of course, and in particular, the 11 zonals, who were all themselves commissioners on the GBC, produced an environment which alienated their peers on the second echelon. This is what formulated, to some extent, the initial Neo-Mutt, which was then, once it formed, a branch of Gaudiya Math. After that, there is a description dedicated to the alleged glories of Swami B. Sridhar, also discussing background of how Neo-Mutt played out in its early years. I have no obligation to cover any of that, and I choose not to do so. Many different topics were discussed, including reaching back to 1968 in India and 2 of Prabhupada's wandering disciples that year in India. The initial prominent second echelon devotees who crossed the river and joined Swami B. Sridhar in the very late 70s and the first half of the 80s are then, in Doktorski's book, listed by name. They are listed according to their initiated names from Prabhupada and the new names given to them when they took sannyas from Swami B. Sridhar. Now you need to know that Prabhupada never changed the names of his initiated disciples when he gave them sannyas. Instead, the prefix Bhakti was simply added to the name, an example of which, Bhakti Swarup Damodar Swami. Changing of the name is rationalized to this day by Neo-Mutt, but that's to be expected. It is to be expected because at heart, they are no longer devoted to His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, although they will use, as they see fit, their original diksha from him. In the early 80s, Thira Krishna, the former temple president of the Culver City Center, a very large center, after he crossed the river and joined Neo-Mutt, started Neo-Mutt's first center in America in San Jose. This center was not recognized by so-called ISKCON, which had previously warned Neo-Mutt's followers and their own followers not to read the books of Swami B. Sridhar. That was the prologue to the eventual schism between so-called ISKCON and Gaudiya Math, which obviously included Neo-Mutt. Thira Krishna and Jayatirtha being one of the original 11 zonals, were together the leading edge of Neo-Mutt, precipitating that schism. E&E then goes on to glorify Tripurari, who reached a fork in the road in the 80s, as he had secured a powerful position in so-called ISKCON as a temple president in San Francisco. He could have gone either way, but he had a close friendship with Thira Krishna, who was just a hop, skip, and a jump down the road at San Jose. He chose to throw in with Neo-Mutt, a moment of fate for the air quotes ISKCON movement. Doktorski then relates personal stories of some other early and prominent members of Neo-Mutt, replete with seemingly heart-rendering anecdotes, making for quite the drama. Finally, the chapter reaches a section which has substance, although not presented in the most accurate way. 3 contentions are delved into in some detail with an obvious slant, and I'm quoted in one of those contentions. The 3 flashpoints of contention are then mentioned. 1, Prabhupada ordering his disciples not to associate with his godbrothers or imbibe teachings and or directives from them. 2, the aforementioned name changes by Swami B. Sridhar to Prabhupada's initiated disciples when he gave them sannyas. And 3, the initial breakup of the governing body of Gaudiya Math immediately subsequent to the disappearance of Siddhanta Saraswati. This last one is in connection to Swami B. Sridhar's entanglement in that schism of 1937. This month's presentation will be utilizing addenda. The first addendum is a hyperlink to a chapter in my most recent book, the one which covers everything connected to Neo-Mutt. It emphasizes the upasiddhanta of no fall, no fault, believed and preached by both Gaudiya Math along with its stepchild and western branch, Neo-Mutt. Addendum 2 is 15 points related to Addendum 3, by the way, that I made in an email to Doktorski. Addendum 3 focuses on key excerpts from a letter to one of Prabhupada's leading secretaries in the spring of 1974. It describes Swami B. Sridhar in particular and his Gaudiya Math godbrothers in general. And it is not favorable to any of them. Prabhupada, in many letters, and even in some purports to scripture in his books, criticized his godbrothers. There were private room conversations where he did so also, sometimes quite forcefully. Those are anecdotal to some extent, so I shall not bring them up here. The aforementioned 3 contentions begin with the subtitle in E&E, and this subtitle is, quote-unquote, Shishyas defend their shiksha guru. Although it is simply reporting, no objective reader could deny that there are assumptions in that subtitle. Similar bias is present in the contentions themselves. The first contention, as just mentioned, is that Prabhupada criticized his godbrothers. He most certainly did, repeatedly. He did not hold them in high esteem. The chief point made in the first contention is that these criticisms, and this is the point made by Neo-Mutt, that these criticisms did not apply to Swami B. Sridhar. One of his new Western Shishyas is quoted making this assertion, and it is patent nonsense. Consult Addendum 3 in the text wall after the endnotes, and you will be disabused of that fellow's notion. Regarding the second contention, I shall simply reproduce here my quote in E&A applied to that second contention. Quote, Kailasa Chandra claimed B.R. Sridhar Maharaj directly reinitiated Buddhi Yoga Das, a Prabhupada initiate, very soon after Prabhupada departed. Neo-Mutt tries to hide these reinitiates, mostly by falsely claiming that they were standard name changes for sannyasis. That was not, by the way, applicable to Buddha Yoga. Such was not the case during Prabhupada's preaching while he was here. None had their names radically changed. Give me some tangible examples of complete name changes while Prabhupada was manifest in his movement. I do not know of any such things, unquote. In relation to the third contention, emoting is used to defend Swami B.R. Sridhar in relation to the breakdown and schism of Gaudiya Math in 1937, just after the disappearance of Siddhanta Saraswati. Most definitely, Swami B.R. Sridhar was an integral player in that event. Here's an excerpt from Addendum 3. Quote, he, referring to Siddhanta Saraswati, said openly, you make a GBC and conduct the mission. So his idea was amongst the members of GBC who would come out successful and self-effulgent acharya would be automatically selected. So Sridhar Maharaj and his two associate gentlemen unauthorizedly selected one acharya, and later it proved a failure, unquote. That was from a letter to Rupanuga, a very well-known letter, dated April 28, 1974. Ananta Vasudev, one of the 13 commissioners in the first GBC meeting after Siddhanta Saraswati's disappearance, was nominated to be the acharya of the whole Gaudiya Math. The vote was 8-5 in favor of his being appointed to that post. But that was not what Siddhanta Saraswati either wanted or authorized. Siddhanta Saraswati did not recognize any of his disciples as qualified for this capstone position atop the hierarchy. He instead specifically ordered that his GBC was to conduct the mission without any sole acharya overseeing how its leading men were to conduct the mission from the centers which each of them controlled. According to Prabhupada, Swami B.R. Sridhar went against this order along with two others on that commission. This led to the nomination of Ananta Vasudev as the new sole acharya. His appointment to that post created a schism, immediate schism, by the way, in which those 5 who voted against Ananta Vasudev broke away. The idea that Swami B.R. Sridhar was not integral to this breakup of the Gaudiya Math is patently false. The historical record establishing it being false was recorded on and for the record in a letter by Prabhupada to a leading secretary in April of 1974. You want to read those excerpts? Consult Addendum 3. Chapter 14 then meanders into syrupy sentiment. Quote, love and trust lacking in ISKCON, unquote. Along with this, another entry, quote, the comfort B.R. Sridhar Maharaj brought via his preaching to some of Prabhupada's disciples was certainly an improvement to the politics and executive force they had suffered in ISKCON, unquote. This is pretty much garbage. However, E&E then begins to present balance in connection to the two opposing points of view by quoting your host speaker. Quote, Kailasa Chandra claims that B.R. Sridhar Maharaj was the principal founder advisor of the Zonal acharya system, and it was due to his bad advice that the policies of the 11 became manifest. In the spring of 1978, he claims Swami B.R. Sridhar successfully injected massive procedural changes. So, you see here that Doktorski uses the verb claims. I didn't claim anything, I just stated the facts. I hear and choose in this part of our presentation to highlight 5 of these massive procedural changes, all from E&E, quotations from E&E. Quote, B.R. Sridhar Maharaj suggested that the zonal acharyas should not accept disciples in other zones except their own. This was similar to the unspoken agreement between the acharyas of the various Gaudiya Math temples after the departure of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada. Kailasa Chandra claims this was a concoction, as the bona fide spiritual master can accept disciples from anywhere on earth. Kailasa Chandra also points out that B.R. Sridhar Maharaj introduced the concept that a guru, even a Madhyam Adhikari guru, must always present the appearance of being an Uttama Adhikari. Quote, it is to deceive the disciple, unquote. In other words, Sridhar Maharaj indicated that all of the new ISKCON gurus should pretend to be Uttama Adhikaris, otherwise their disciples might doubt their legitimacy. Kailasa Chandra further claims that B.R. Sridhar Maharaj also introduced the transitive misconception, quote, Ritvik Acharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya, unquote. By this he meant that Prabhupada's appointing Ritviks during his manifest presence meant that they all then automatically became acharyas, read Diksha gurus, upon his manifest departure. And this principle of transitive change is nowhere verified in Shastra. Kailasa Chandra claims that B.R. Sridhar Maharaj introduced the process of pretension. Quote, just put on the uniform and you will become the soldier, unquote. He told them not to feel insecure about their actual less than exemplary third-class spiritual development. Many ISKCON leaders at the time, it appears, were less than neophytes because neophytes follow the rules and regulations of Vaidhi Bhakti. So less than exemplary third-class spiritual development because if they simply put on the dress of the acharya, then they would become real acharyas. With Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and Krishna's help, just take this garb and the dress will tell you what you have to do, unquote, Sridhar Maharaj advised. However, Prabhupada contradicted this. Quote, of course, one must deserve these facilities. First deserve, then desire, unquote. Kailasa Chandra notes that B.R. Sridhar Maharaj also recommended that the 11 should form a special committee within the GBC that would control everything from behind the scenes. Quote, there should be an acharya board to guide the whole thing from behind without non-acharya within the meeting, unquote, he said, meaning Sridhar Maharaj. I am not going to present all or even most of the Neo-Mutt arguments made in favor of Swami B.R. Sridhar. I have no obligation to do so. The audio would go too long if I did that. Just as importantly, why should I pollute your minds with such propaganda? You are free to consult E&E via Kindle or hard copy if you want to read any of that. Tattvamasi. Here and there, however, there will be a factual nugget that is made by one of the Neo-Mutt leaders, such as this one. Quote, B.V. Shuddha Maharaj pointed out that since the 11 tried to cheat B.R. Sridhar Maharaj from the beginning, Sridhar Maharaj turned the tables and instead cheated them, unquote. This point is factual. Swami B.R. Sridhar was playing 3D chess with the 11 seeds of personal ambition, and they were only making moves on their own in-house checkerboard. One of them even said to him that he considered the Navadvip Mahant to be non-different from Prabhupada. They did not all have that attitude, but some of them did, contributing to the major schism between so-called ISKCON and Neo-Mutt in 1982. But since he was way ahead of them, as such, he had a huge advantage over them. He wasn't accepting anything they said, but they lapped up everything he said, much of which was false and bad advice. This is pointed out threadbare and in great detail in Addendum 1. Consult it to advantage. The 11 seeds of personal ambition needed fertile soil, and Swami B Sridhar provided it. In the process, he cheated everyone in Prabhupada's movement. He also formed a new branch of Gaudiya Math from those disgruntled second echelon men. E&E then asks a poignant question, quote, upon deeper analysis of the conversations in the spring of 1978 between Sridhar Maharaj and the GBC, it becomes apparent, as Kailasa Chandra says, that Sridhar Maharaj did introduce concepts in ISKCON which were not in the same mood as Srila Prabhupada's concepts. But could he do otherwise, given his Gaudiya Math background and conditioning? Plus, Srila Prabhupada, by telling his disciples that Sridhar Maharaj had messed things up in 1937 in that letter to Rupanuga, after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's departure, in that letter that had warned them, meaning Prabhupada's disciples, not to take these kinds of concepts from Sridhar Maharaj after his disappearance. So if the 11 did take Sridhar Maharaj's advice, when it was not exactly according to Prabhupada's teaching, it is because that advice was just what they wanted to hear. Therefore, the blame lies on the ISKCON GBC for following the advice, not on Srila B.R. Sridhar Maharaj. All right, I've just said that this was a quote from E&E. To a very significant degree, it is a word-for-word quote, but here and there I've injected other things into it. So if you want to read the exact quote and notice where I've made some injections, then purchase E&E either in Kindle or hard copy and go to that section, and then you can make those decisions for yourself. So again, to reiterate, the last sentence of this quotation from E&E, so if the 11 did take Sridhar Maharaj's advice, which was not exactly according to Prabhupada's teachings, it is because that advice was just what they wanted to hear. Therefore, the blame lies on the ISKCON GBC for following that advice, not on Srila B.R. Sridhar Maharaj. Half right. The blame lies with both. Nevertheless, there are bona fide interjections in this chapter that have value. Here's another one. Quote, Sridhar Maharaj also differed with Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada on some philosophical issues. In his 69-page essay entitled Srila Prabhupada and Gaudiya Math, Dhruta Karma elaborated on one of the philosophical differences between Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and B.R. Sridhar Maharaj. Quote, Sridhar Maharaj had a concept of the origin of the jiva that was different than Prabhupada's. Prabhupada taught that all jivas were originally with Krishna and had fallen from the spiritual world into this world. Sridhar Maharaj taught that the jivas had not originally been with Krishna. Sridhar Maharaj's ISKCON followers turned it into a major issue. Yes, they said, Sridhar Maharaj was giving esoteric truths beyond those taught by Prabhupada. They, the followers of Sridhar Maharaj, were the ones with the true understanding now. And ISKCON should join them in accepting these truths. There developed a schism of a kind that would be repeated in coming years. Just by acknowledging the fact that Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and B.R. Sridhar Maharaj differed on this one point, Kailasa Chandra claims, is enough for a Prabhupada disciple or follower to reject Sridhar Maharaj outright, unquote. It is not a minor point. It is a major foundational siddhanta, and Prabhupada gave us that eternal siddhanta. Gaudiya Math and its stepchild branch Neo-Mutt present the upasiddhanta, the wrong conclusion. The right conclusion, that siddhanta, is the pillar of Vaishnavism. It is not merely an esoteric fine point. If you take advantage of the hyperlink provided in Addendum 1, this crux controversy is discussed there threadbare. Here's but one of its entries. Quote, unless one develops full devotional service to Krishna, he goes up only to Brahma Sayujya, then falls down. But after millions and millions of years of keeping oneself away from the Leela of the Lord, when one comes to Krishna consciousness, this period becomes insignificant, just like dreaming. Because he falls down from Brahma Sayujya, he thinks that this may be his origin. But he does not remember that before that even, he was with Krishna, unquote. And we move on then in this chapter 14, and E&E then touches upon the siksha guru controversy. Oh, let me tell you, this is a nasty one, because Neo-Mutt is fanatical about it. Although, it's clear by now, Neo-Mutt does not accept everything Prabhupada states. They don't accept him literally. They do take his calling Swami B.R. Sridhar as his siksha guru to be an incontrovertible truth. It isn't. Now, to its credit, E&E covers this controversy to some extent. The gist is that Prabhupada in 1968, and we mentioned this previously, had two wandering disciples accomplishing little, if any, real service, who became polluted by Prabhupada's very inimical godbrothers, Swami Ban and Vrindavan. They were staying at his center, they were dependent upon him, and they were on the verge of being lost to Prabhupada's movement. Indeed, one of them was, as Swami Ban gave that young man a new name. This was a major offense to Prabhupada, obviously. The other disciple was Achyutananda, the first disciple of Prabhupada to dance at Tompkins Square Park in New York City while Prabhupada was leading a kirtan there, which he did for every day in the early days. Achyutananda was also one of the first to receive initiation from Prabhupada. In order to save both of them, Prabhupada snail-mailed a letter ordering them to travel to West Bengal and live with another of his godbrothers, and that happened to be Swami B.R. Sridhar. In this letter, this 1968 letter, he glorified that elder godbrother, and this can be seen as a kind of incentive for his wandering disciples to follow the order. The obvious issue is how to interpret Prabhupada in that letter, wherein he did call Swami B.R. Sridhar as siksha guru. If the direct interpretation, which generally should be accepted, is applied here, then it's not difficult to comprehend why Neo-Mutt makes this the centerpiece of its justification. However, there are occasions, this being one of them, where the indirect application is merited. Palina partiate, judge by the results. Did what went down after Prabhupada departed and Swami B.R. Sridhar rose to such prominent influence, did any of that provide evidence of him, Swami B.R. Sridhar, being in the category of the founder acharya's guru? That's a rhetorical question if your higher intelligence is active. In that all-important letter of April 1974, reproduced as Addendum 3, Prabhupada calls Swami B.R. Sridhar, quote, the best of the lot, unquote. You do not call your siksha guru such a thing. And you do not call a Mahabhagavat that either. If you are interested to put the pieces of this controversy together in the right way, you can consult the longest endnote I have ever made thus far, and that's called endnote 11. One final point. E&E presents evidence that the devotee who took reinitiation from Swami Ban in 1968 never received that letter from Prabhupada ordering him to leave Swami Ban. And by the way, Prabhupada deprecated Swami Ban. To leave Swami Ban and then travel to Navadvip, West Bengal. That disciple who claims he never received the letter stayed, but Achyutananda did not stay in Vrindavan. He went to West Bengal, and he did not take reinitiation from Swami Ban. This strongly indicates, indeed it is conclusive evidence, that Achyutananda did receive the letter. We're not concerned about the other guy. He took reinitiation. What do we care about him? We care about Achyutananda. He read the letter and knew what was being communicated and what was being ordered, and he acted on it. E&E then segues to a discussion of that all-important letter to Rupanuga on April 28, 1974. We've referenced it repeatedly so far. And, as already noted, your host speaker has decided to include it as Addendum 3 so that you can study it. Its purport is self-evident. It describes that Rupanuga's doubt about the authenticity of Swami B.R. Sridhar is justified. It gives details about how he was integral to the appointment of Ananta Vasudeva as the sole acharya, which immediately catalyzed into that major schism of Gaudiya Math in 1937, just days after Siddhanta Sarasvati's departure. As long as you are not afflicted by Neo-Mutt propaganda, you cannot ignore what Prabhupada's view of Swami B.R. Sridhar really was. He did not glorify him or his godbrothers at all in that 1974 letter. He also warned that the ISKCON movement should not follow the bad example of what went down in Gaudiya Math in 1937. However, under the influence, bad advice, and massive meddling of Swami B.R. Sridhar, the ISKCON movement did just that. Only times 11. Instead of one Acharya Vasudeva, 11 of them. And again, in this letter of April 1974, Prabhupada orders all of his disciples to avoid his godbrothers, informing them that his godbrothers will not help them, but are, on the contrary, very competent to harm their progress in the spiritual line. Consult Addendum 2 and Addendum 3 for all of the details. Chapter 14 steps into the Neo-Mutt quicksand under its subheader, which is called, Which Order Should Be Followed? This subheader is misleading because Prabhupada gave many orders, not just one to avoid his godbrothers, to not purchase their books, etc. The other quote-unquote order referred to in this connection is a will-o'-the-wisp. It alleges, in relation to Gaudiya Math, that Prabhupada reversed everything he said and everything he wrote, and he reversed it in the very last days of his manifest physical presence, rendering all of his previous orders and criticisms in connection to his godbrothers null and void. Apparently, in this alleged draconian reversal, this went down in one meeting. Although, because the whole thing is anecdotal, who can be sure of anything connected to it, including even if it took place at all? Who was present? Was it one or two or three leading secretaries? We don't know. Is there any solid evidence of it? Any tape recording? Any video? Any transcription of the meeting? Negative. There's nothing solid about any of it. That's not its only flaw. What was the context of this alleged meeting? We don't know, except anecdotally from vested interests, read Neo-Mutt loyalists, who make it a major factor of their argument. Any sane devotee would agree that there could be nuances in context of whatever was said by Prabhupada in this connection, again, if any of it even transpired. However, we have no solid basis to work from in order to glean context. Prabhupada's books will, in due course of time, become the law books of mankind for thousands of years. This statement, by myself, is not in the category of prediction. On the contrary, it is incontrovertible truth in the form of prophecy. In the purports of his books, Prabhupada criticizes his godbrothers in Gaudiya Math. That is called vastu, substance. It will remain. That criticism will not be called out of his books. If it is by some bogus entity, then it'll be reinstated a bit later, that's all. In many of his letters, Prabhupada criticizes his godbrothers in Gaudiya Math. He gives orders to his disciples, meaning all of his disciples, in many of his letters in this connection. The historical record of how he was mistreated by his former Math and its leading men is on and for the record. This historical accuracy is ascertained for posterity. Now you may ask the question, what is the crux of this controversy? What is the chief justification, read alleged justification, for Neo-Mutt to blow the alleged new directive way out of proportion with no conclusive evidence, what to speak of incontrovertible truth? So now remember, that's the question. And now I'm going to give the answer. Believe it or not, it's an argument from chronological timing. To wit, the last order overcomes all other orders connected to any order discussed previously, or given previously, unquote. This is puerile logic. It's childishness. It's nonsense, chronological timing. Ascertainment comes from vastu. It comes from substance. It never comes from a rumor or anecdote, which lacks conclusive evidence by its very nature. 1,000 years from now, the devotees in Prabhupada's branch, if the branch has not been scattered by them and by then and lost, 1,000 years from now, devotees in his branch will not be relying upon an anecdotal account nullifying all that Prabhupada said and wrote about Gaudiya Math and his godbrothers in his books and his letters. Those are vastu. The rest is will-o-wisp. The rest is anecdotal with no conclusive evidence and no context. And there's another reason. And this one, it could be said to trump all of the solid evidence against Neo-Mutt thus far presented in regard to this anecdote that Prabhupada reversed everything. And what is it? What's the other reason? Palena parachiyate, judged by the results. What was the result of Prabhupada's first and second echelon men meeting with Swami B or Sridhar? What was the result of them implementing the bad advice he gave to them? Devastation of Prabhupada's movement was the result. The new order, the last order, the bias of this new order does not merit quotation. There's a bias in it. It's obvious. It has been summarized herein, with the Siddhanta also provided. In summary, don't fall for the unite with Gaudiya Math chronological timing argument, especially since it's based upon evidence so flimsy that it would be immediately dismissed in any court of law as hearsay. E&E then segues to Swami Narayan of the Devananda Keshavaji Math in Mathura. After describing the glories of Swami Narayan, E&E then presents a vitriolic back and forth between those virulently opposed to Swami Narayan and those who are dedicated to him as his disciples. Included in E&E, here are two criticisms of Swami Narayan. Quote, Narayan Maharaj said I was basically a demon when I brought out the poison issue. He said, this is nonsense, and he invited me to his ashram to talk about it. I waited for 10 hours while he hid in his room, then he sneaked off the property. He could not hear one question from me, and he did not want to hear the poison tape I brought with me, unquote. That excerpt's from Tim Lee. His initiated name, as you probably know, is Paranjan Das. Here's another one. Quote, Narayan Maharaj was an offender to the real Srila Prabhupada. What I find even more offensive is Prabhupada's disciples who abandoned Prabhupada and ran to Narayan Maharaj, and then he reinitiated them, unquote. That's from a devotee named Rasika Rai Das. Those are both in E&E, as I just said. I'm not going to get heavy into it. E&E closes the chapter by discussing some topics that are a bit tangential. It segues into a discussion of the different styles of operation of Gaudiya Math, also read Neo-Mutt, and the current iteration of ISKCON, read so-called ISKCON. I have been to a number of Gaudiya Math centers in my life, and I can tell you from first-hand experience, they are different in style, they are different in mood, they are different in general vichara than Prabhupada's movement ever was, and that includes Siddhanta or philosophy, of course. Now, near the end of the book, near the end of the chapter, that is, so-called ISKCON is quoted in this section that I'm on now, and it's quoted about, quote-unquote, collective leadership, or the collective authority system, claiming it differs from Gaudiya Math's and Neo-Mutt's sole acharya system. Oh, there's a long explanation given by the so-called ISKCON representative in this final section, and that explanation is a mixed bag, as it's an example of half-truth in the guise of a full exposition. So I came down on it. E&E then included my commentary via email sent to Doktorski of that so-called ISKCON, air quotes ISKCON rationalization. My email to Doktorski reads as follows, quote, "What claptrap? It's actually a form of self-apotheosis on institutional scale. At the very least, the megalomania of an institutional delusion. This should not be misinterpreted to mean that I accept the Mutt's gurus. Of course I do not. However, to compare them to small sailboats on placid waters, and so-called ISKCON and its governing body to a fleet of huge warships in a major war on choppy seas is such tripe. If the guru is bona fide, no matter how small his ashram, his seva and his camp are both blessed by the Lord Vishnu. Small is beautiful," unquote. Chapter 14 concludes with a discussion of the loss of charisma in so-called ISKCON, particularly with the change from the zonal acharyas to the second transformation of the collegiate compromise. This section is quite well done, including insights from a devotee initiated in 1973 who is now a scholar on the subject of cult charisma. The issue of Prabhupada's devotees being enjoined not to criticize his godbrothers is also included under this subheader, and I am also quoted in that close of the chapter. Quote, "Regarding the paragraph quoting Prabhupada as enjoining his disciples not to criticize his godbrothers, even though he criticizes them, Madhava Maharaj, one of Prabhupada's godbrothers, held Prabhupada in contempt and vehemently criticized Prabhupada. But Madhava Maharaj made no attempt to interfere with Prabhupada's movement. Ditto for Damodar Maharaj, another godbrother of Prabhupada. To a lesser extent, ditto even for Ban Maharaj. He took away and so-called reinitiated a disciple, Rishikesh, but the damage was very limited, and from an overall perspective, it was more or less ineffective. On the other hand, Swami B. Sridhar interfered with Prabhupada's movement big time. The history of the movement after Prabhupada's departure would be utterly incomplete without mentioning all the bad advice from the Navadvip Mahant, as well as all of the meetings, as well as the eventual schism between so-called ISKCON and Neo-Mutt. All of that is integral to the history. For those, and there are many, who believe no uncle would have been better than the uncle from Navadvip, we have every right to criticize his interference. We also have every right to point out and reject all of his bad advice. It is our duty to do so. The admonition from Prabhupada, well before any of the drastic interference by that godbrother went down. So that admonition that, don't criticize my godbrothers, it has no application at this time in relation to Swami B. Sridhar. The admonition is etiquette. The admonition is etiquette. And that etiquette is forced to take a back seat and to be ignored due to massive interference in Prabhupada's movement by Swami B. Sridhar. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. The initial deviation of the zonal acharya imposition created a backlash. It led, but only in part, to second echelon men, cracking the movement's unity further, breaking away to join Gaudiya Math in Navadvip. Previously, Gaudiya Math had interfered in Prabhupada's society. That was in relation to Brahmananda, the second crisis. However, in the late 70s and early 80s, the great sinister movement, which is what Prabhupada called Gaudiya Math in that letter to Hangsadutta, September 2nd, 1970, the great sinister movement brought a worse version of massive interference to the next level of outrage. Neo-Mutt, today's Neo-Mutt, is part of that same poison tree. Do not enter its vortex under any circumstances. Analogously, employing a color code to the three deviations of today, Ritvik is ugly brown, and so-called ISKCON is a darker shade of that ugly brown. However, Neo-Mutt is black. Pitch black. Sadeva Samya,